He had built an empire from nothing. Hotels that touched the skylines of 3 cities. A name that made boardrooms go quiet and assistants stand up straighter when he walked down a hallway. A life so insulated from ordinary struggle that he had long since stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing a hum when you've lived with it long enough. He had everything. Everything, that is, except the one thing that money had quietly, surgically, removed from him over 2 decades of relentless building. The ability to truly see another person. Her name was Lily. She had been working in his home for 11 months. Every morning she arrived before sunrise, while the house still held the gray stillness of early morning. She moved through the rooms quietly, efficiently, like water finding its level. She didn't linger in doorways. She didn't make conversation beyond what was asked of her. She cleaned, she cooked, she organized, and then she left. Every single evening, 6 o'clock sharp, she was gone. Marcus Calloway, billionaire, founder and CEO of Calloway Hospitality Group, owner of this 10,000 square foot estate in Raleigh, North Carolina, had never once in 11 months thought to ask where she went. Until one Tuesday evening, everything changed. He was coming down the main staircase when he caught sight of her by the front door. She was adjusting the straps of 2 large canvas bags with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times. One bag smelled of food, something warm, something that had been cooked with care. The other bag was heavy, the kind of heaviness that comes from paper, files maybe, documents. He stopped on the stairs. Something about the scene held him in place. Not suspicion, exactly. More like the feeling you get when you reach for something familiar and find it has been subtly, silently rearranged. He had seen her leave 100 times, but something about seeing her tonight, the intentionality of those bags, the straightness of her spine as she adjusted the straps, the quiet purpose in her face, made him feel for the first time like he was seeing something he had been looking at without registering. He didn't stop her. He didn't call out. He just watched her walk through the gate and disappear into the amber evening light. And then he stood at the top of his staircase in his 10,000 square foot home, in the silence that had always felt like peace but was suddenly, uncomfortably, feeling like something else entirely. That night he could not stop thinking about her. Before we go further, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and tell me where you're watching from. It truly means a lot to see how far these stories connect with people around the world. Let me give you some context, because this story doesn't start with the maid, it starts with the man. Marcus Calloway was 43 years old. He had started with nothing. A studio apartment in Charlotte, a community college business degree he'd paid for himself, and a stubborn refusal to believe that the life he'd been born into had anything to do with the life he was capable of building. By 30, he owned 3 hotel properties. By 37, Calloway Hospitality Group had been featured in Forbes. By 40, it had 12 locations and a reputation for boutique luxury that made larger chains take notice. He had earned every inch of it, and in the process, he had also, quietly and without fully realizing it, traded away pieces of himself. His marriage had ended 4 years ago, not dramatically, not with betrayal or screaming, but with the slow, mutual recognition that somewhere along the way, 2 people had stopped being curious about each other. His ex-wife had described him in the final conversation before the paperwork was signed as someone who is always in the room, but never really there. He had thought about that sentence more times than he would admit. He lived alone in the Raleigh estate. His housekeeper, before Lily, had quit after 8 months. Something about a better offer, though he suspected it was something less flattering than that. The agency had sent him Lily Monroe on a Monday morning in late autumn, and she had started work the same afternoon. She was 26. She arrived with a tote bag and a professional demeanor, and set immediately to work with such quiet, total efficiency that Marcus had simply accepted her presence in the way you accept a well-designed system, with appreciation for its function, and very little curiosity about how it had been built. She wore the same small stud earrings every day. She declined the staff Wi-Fi password when he offered it. She left exactly at 6, except on the 3 occasions when he'd had evening guests, when she had stayed until the clearing up was done, and then left without asking for overtime. He had noticed briefly that she seemed slightly tired on the mornings after those late nights. He had not asked why. After the Tuesday evening with the bags, he pulled up her employment profile on the agency's secure portal. The file was immaculate. Clean record, 2 strong previous references, no complaints. Her listed address was a neighborhood on the south side of the city, the kind of place Marcus drove through only when GPS rerouted him around highway construction. Her educational background said, some college, not completed. Under skills, the list read, cooking, cleaning, caregiving, light admin, CPR certified, and this is where Marcus stopped scrolling, adult literacy instruction. He read those 3 words 3 times. Adult literacy instruction. He closed the laptop. He poured himself a drink he didn't finish. He went to bed and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours. Who was this woman who cleaned his bathrooms and listed adult literacy instruction among her skills the way someone else might list Excel or defensive driving? What was in those bags? Where was she going with such conviction every single evening for the 11 months she had worked in his house? He had the resources to find out with a single phone call to his private investigator. He had done it before, with business associates, with contractors, with people he needed to understand quickly. But something stopped him from making that call. Something that felt, uncomfortably, like shame. He wanted to find out himself. He wanted to look. The following Friday, Marcus canceled an evening call with his operations director, something he had done exactly twice in 5 years, and sat in his study trying to decide if he had lost his mind. He was a man who ran 12 hotel properties, who managed 200 employees, who had sat across from investors and bankers and city council members and held his ground every single time. And he was now sitting in the dark, in a rental car, a gray Camry he'd booked through an app so no one on his staff would see it parked in his driveway, wearing a baseball cap he'd found at the back of his closet, waiting to follow his housekeeper. He felt ridiculous. He also didn't leave. At 6 o'clock on the dot, the front gate opened. Lily came out. Same 2 bags. Same steady walk. She turned left onto the sidewalk without looking back, without looking at her phone, without hesitation. She moved the way someone moves when the path they're walking is so deeply familiar it has become instinct. Marcus pulled the rental out slowly, keeping 3 cars back. She didn't take a rideshare. She didn't hail a cab. She walked 6 blocks to the bus stop and stood there in the cooling evening air with her 2 heavy bags and waited. When the bus came, a city bus worn around the edges, its route number faded, she got on. Marcus followed in the rental. The ride through the city took about 20 minutes. He watched the neighborhoods change in real time through the windshield, the way they changed so quickly that it was disorienting, the way you could go from wide, tree-lined avenues to narrow, crowded streets in the span of 6 blocks and feel as though you had traveled somewhere further than geography could explain. Marcus realized he had not been to this part of the city in years, maybe ever. The bus stopped on a corner between a laundromat and a shuttered pawn shop. Lily stepped off. She walked half a block south, turned through an open chain-link fence, and disappeared into a low, flat-roofed building with fluorescent light spilling warm through its front windows. Above the entrance, hand-painted in careful white letters on a dark green board, were the words, Bridgepoint Community Learning Center open to all. Free always. Marcus pulled to the curb across the street and sat very still. He didn't go in. He wasn't ready to go in. Instead, he leaned forward in the driver's seat and looked through the wide front window of the building, which was low and unobstructed and lit up against the evening like a lantern. I want you to stay with me here. Because what Marcus was about to see through that window, this is the moment this story turns. Don't go anywhere. There were perhaps 20 people inside, seated at folding tables arranged in a loose U-shape. They were of every age. A woman in hospital scrubs who still had her badge clipped to her chest. An elderly man in a neat button-down shirt with a hearing aid curving behind his ear. A young mother with a toddler settled on her lap, the child drowsy and warm, one hand clutching the edge of the table. There was a teenager in the back row, arms folded, looking slightly skeptical. There was a middle-aged man in work clothes with paint still on his forearms. They each had a pen. They each had a handout. And at the front of the room, standing at a whiteboard with a marker in her hand, was Lily. Marcus blinked. Not the Lily who moved through his house in careful, measured silence. Not the Lily who said good morning, Mr. Calloway, with her eyes at a respectful angle, and then disappeared back into the kitchen. This Lily had her shoulders back and her chin level, and her whole face open in a way that he had never once seen inside his home. She was laughing at something a student had said. A real laugh. Sudden and warm. She turned back to the board and wrote something, then turned around and pointed to the handout in front of the young mother. Leaning across the table to indicate a specific line, she knelt beside the elderly man. She spoke close to him, slowly, with exaggerated lip movement so he could follow. He nodded. Then he tried. Then he got it. And the look on his face when he got it. The look of a man in his 70s who had spent a lifetime pretending a particular gap didn't exist, suddenly feeling it close, was the kind of look you don't forget. On the whiteboard, Marcus could read, "Today's lesson, navigating medical forms." She was teaching adults how to read hospital intake forms, insurance documents, discharge instructions, the paperwork that stands between a person and the care they need. Marcus sat in the car and felt the ground shift under him. He watched for 40 minutes. He watched her celebrate a woman who finally sounded out the word prescription without hesitation, the woman raising both fists in victory, everyone at the table laughing and clapping. He watched her kneel beside the teenager in the back row, the skeptical one with folded arms, and say something quiet just to him that made the boy's posture change, made his arms come uncrossed, made him reach for his pen. And then he noticed the handouts. He recognized the paper, the weight of it, the particular off-white color. It was the same paper that lived in the printer in his downstairs office, the office he used perhaps once a month, the printer he had thought was malfunctioning when he noticed the paper level had dropped last week. It hadn't been malfunctioning. She had printed these materials on his machine. She had used his paper and his ink to make the handouts that these people were holding right now, the handouts that were teaching a grandmother to read a hospital form, the handouts that were giving the teenager in the back row a reason to uncross his arms. Marcus had no idea how to feel about that. He only knew that the word that came to mind was not anger. When the session ended, Lily opened one of her canvas bags. Inside were stacked food containers. Real food, the kind that takes time to prepare. Rice, braised beans, sliced fruit. She set them on one of the folding tables and quietly began distributing them, starting with the elderly man and the young mother with the toddler. A woman in her 50s, someone Marcus hadn't particularly noticed during the lesson, crossed the room and took both of Lily's hands in hers and held them. She said something, too quiet for Marcus to hear from the car, but he could see Lily's face when she heard it. He could see the way she didn't look away, didn't deflect, didn't make herself smaller to accommodate someone else's emotion. She just received it, held the woman's hands back, said something in return that made the woman nod deeply, the way you nod when someone says a true thing. Marcus looked down at his own hands on the steering wheel. He thought about his pantry, full of food he restocked on a standing order every 2 weeks, food that he ate a fraction of and the rest got quietly cleared away before it expired. He thought about the printer that he used for boarding passes and occasionally for contracts. He thought about his house, the rooms that went dark for months because he had no reason to enter them. He thought about all the square footage of his life that he had filled with things he never used. And then he looked back through the window at Lily, who was now helping the young mother pack her things, the toddler now awake and reaching for Lily's sleeve with small, confident hands. He felt, sitting alone in that rental car in the dark, something he had not felt in a very long time. Ashamed of himself, not the performative kind, not the kind that announces itself and then moves on, the deep kind, the kind that settles into the chest and makes you understand, without negotiation, that something has to change. He drove home slowly, without the radio. He sat in his driveway for 7 minutes before he went inside. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study until 2 in the morning, the amber lamp making a small warm island in the dark room, and he thought about a woman who spent her days cleaning a rich man's house, and her evenings feeding strangers and teaching adults the words that could save their lives. He thought about the fact that she had been doing this for how long? How many evenings had she left his gate at exactly 6 o'clock and made her way across the city to a room full of people the rest of the city had quietly agreed to forget? He found Bridgepoint on his phone. The website was modest, clearly built by someone who knew what they needed it to do and had used the simplest tools available to do it. A landing page, a mission statement, a schedule, a small earnest donation link that made him feel vaguely embarrassed about the renovation costs on his last hotel acquisition. There was a photo section, group shots from what looked like graduation events, students holding certificates, faces luminous with the particular joy that comes from earning something you once believed was out of reach. And in several of the photos, if you looked carefully, was Lily. Almost always at the edge of the frame, almost always in the act of clapping or pointing or leaning in toward a student who had just achieved something. Never in the center, never the one being celebrated. Beneath one of the photos, a caption, "Lead volunteer and program director Lily Monroe, with our spring graduating cohort. Lead volunteer and program director. Not paid, volunteer. And program director, meaning she wasn't just showing up to help, she was running it. She had built a curriculum, maintained a schedule, recruited and retained students, and managed the whole operation on volunteer hours and whatever she could scrape together from a housekeeper's salary. Marcus set the phone face down on his desk. He thought about every morning for the past 11 months. The quiet "Good morning, Mr. Calloway." The tray set with precision. The way she moved through his house like she had made a private agreement with it to cause as little disturbance as possible. He had interpreted that quietness as professionalism, as appropriate deference. He had never once considered that it might be something else, that it might be what you look like when you have learned very early that certain rooms are not designed to see you. He whispered into the empty study, "Who are you, Lily Monroe?" No answer. Just the lamp. Just the dark. Just the growing, urgent, overdue question of a man who had spent 20 years being seen by everyone and seeing almost no one. If this story is already sitting with you differently than you expected, drop a comment below. Tell me what part of it got to you. I promise I read every single one. The next morning, he was at the dining table before she arrived. In 11 months, that had never happened. She noticed. He could see it in the small pause she made when she came through the kitchen door and found him there. Hands around an empty mug, watching the window, not reading his phone. The pause lasted less than a second. Then she composed herself and came to the table with a tray. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway." "Good morning." He waited until she had set the tray down. "Lily, please sit." Another pause. Longer this time. In 11 months, he had never asked her to sit at his table. She placed the coffee pot on the trivet and pulled out the chair across from him with the careful precision of someone who wants to take up as little space as possible. She sat at the very edge of the seat, her hands folded on the table, her posture composed and professional and, he could see it now that he was actually looking, defensive in the way that is too practiced to be anything but deep. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "I followed you Friday evening." The silence was immediate and total. Her hands tightened on the table. He watched her face do something complex and controlled, the way faces do when a person is managing something big in a very small amount of time. "I followed you to Bridgepoint," he continued. "I sat across the street and watched through the window for almost an hour. I watched you teach. I watched you give out the food." He paused. "I saw the handouts." She looked at him with her chin level, waiting for the accusation, braced for it. "I used your printer," she said quietly and quickly. "I should have asked. I'll pay for what I used. The paper, the ink. That's not what I want to talk about, he said. Then what? Why didn't you ever ask me for help? The question landed in the air between them and stayed there. She tilted her head slightly. In all the time she had worked for him, he had never seen her look anything other than composed. Now she looked, briefly, before she reeled it back, genuinely caught off guard. Because it isn't your problem to solve, Mr. Calloway. I'm not talking about it being my problem. I'm asking why you never thought I might want to help. She looked at him carefully, measuring. People in your position say that, she said finally, and they usually mean something adjacent to it, but not quite it. He felt the precision of that land. He didn't argue it. Tell me about the center, he said instead. How did it start? She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she let out a slow breath and she began. My father couldn't read. Not at all. He'd grown up in a system that passed him along, moved him from grade to grade without anyone taking the time to notice or to care that he hadn't learned the thing that all the other learning depends on. By the time he was an adult, he had gotten very good at hiding it. He was smart, genuinely smart. He could fix anything mechanical. He had an almost photographic memory for directions and faces and conversations. He was the kind of man people liked and trusted immediately. He managed. She paused. When I was 19, my mother got sick, seriously sick. She needed treatment. She qualified for it. The doctor said she was a good candidate, but the system that was supposed to help her required paperwork. Form after form. Insurance verification, prior authorization requests, follow-up documentation. My father tried. He really tried. But he couldn't navigate it. He would bring home the forms and stare at them and put them back in the envelope and carry them around for days while the clock ran down on what could still be done for her. She stopped. Her voice had remained completely steady throughout. That steadiness, Marcus realized, was not the absence of feeling. It was the result of having told this story enough times to have found the way through it, without losing herself. We buried her that winter, and I made a promise at her grave that I would find every person like my father, every person who was invisible to a system built on the assumption that everyone can read the forms, and give them the words they needed to be seen. One person at a time if I had to. Marcus did not speak for a long time. How long have you been running the center? He asked finally. 6 years. 6 years. He let that sit. 6 years of city buses and folding chairs and food she had cooked in her own apartment on a housekeeper's salary and carried across town in canvas bags. 6 years of evenings spent in a room with mismatched furniture teaching grown adults the words that Marcus Calloway used every single day without ever once thinking about them. He stood up from the table. I'm sorry, he said, for 11 months of not asking who you were. She looked at him for a long moment. Not with warmth, not yet, but with something more careful than that. Something that looked like the beginning of a reassessment. She nodded once. Then she reached for the coffee pot. Would you like me to pour that for you, sir? Yes, he said, and then quietly, Thank you, Lily. She paused for just a moment before she poured. He had said her name probably dozens of times over 11 months. But something about the way he said it that morning was different, and she heard it. He could tell she heard it. The weeks that followed changed the atmosphere of the house. It wasn't dramatic. There were no declared moments. It happened the way light changes in late afternoon, gradually, then all at once. He stopped eating breakfast alone in the silence of the dining room with his phone propped against the coffee pot. She stopped moving through the house as though her presence in any given room was something to be minimized. He started coming to the kitchen earlier. She started taking slightly longer over her morning tasks, and he understood that she wasn't being inefficient. She was leaving a door open, in the way people do when they're not entirely sure yet, but they're no longer entirely closed. On a Thursday morning, about 2 weeks after the conversation at the dining table, Marcus came downstairs at 6:45 a.m. and found Lily at the kitchen table with her own books spread out in front of her. Not his things, not work. Her own books, her own notes, her own handwriting filling the margins of a thick folder. She startled when she heard him on the stairs and began gathering everything quickly, the way you do when you've been caught doing something private in a space that doesn't belong to you. "Don't," he said, and then, "What are you working on?" She hesitated. Then she held up the folder. The cover read, in her own handwriting, "Bridging the Gap. Adult Literacy and Dignity in Low-Income Communities. Final Capstone." "I'm finishing a diploma," she said, "in adult education, community college, evenings." He looked at her. He thought about what her evenings looked like. The bus across the city, the class at Bridgepoint that ran until 9, the bus back home, the studying that had to come after. Every day? 5 days a week? Saturdays sometimes. "May I?" He reached toward the folder. She passed it to him. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where she usually set his breakfast out in silence, and he read. He read for 40 minutes. The food she had prepared sat cooling on the counter, and neither of them mentioned it. The capstone was extraordinary. Not in the way that the reports Marcus encountered in his professional life were extraordinary. Not slick, not carefully branded, not optimized for a specific audience. Extraordinary in the raw, disorienting way that real things sometimes are. It was full of interviews with Bridgepoint students, transcribed verbatim in their own voices. A 67-year-old retired mechanic who had spent his entire adult life developing elaborate systems to conceal the fact that he could not read a street sign. A nursing aide who had been passed over for advancement 3 times because she couldn't complete the written licensing exam. A woman in her 50s who had never read a bedtime story to any of her grandchildren because she didn't have the words. And woven through the whole document, quiet and unsentimental, was Lily's own story. Her father, her mother, the winter burial, the promise. When Marcus looked up, she was watching him from across the table with her hands folded around her coffee cup. "I have read proposals from people who get paid several $100,000 a year to write them," he said slowly. "I have read strategic impact documents from some of the best resourced nonprofit organizations in this country." He set the folder down. "None of them carried half the truth of this." She looked down at the table. "I'm just trying to tell their stories the way they deserve to be told." "No," he said, and his voice was quieter and more deliberate than she had ever heard it. "You're telling our story, the story of everyone who got comfortable enough to stop seeing the people around them." Something moved across her face. She looked up at him and held his gaze for a moment longer than she had ever allowed herself to. A week after that morning, Marcus asked her to stay after work. He made coffee himself, fumbling slightly with the machine which he realized he had lived with for 3 years without ever learning to use, and brought 2 cups to the kitchen table. "I want to fund Bridgepoint," he said, "and I want to help you build beyond it. A network, 5 centers, maybe 10. I can cover the build-out, the staff, the materials. You would run the program. You would make every decision about curriculum, about hiring, about everything that matters." He watched her face move through a series of things. "That's very generous," she said finally. "But," she exhaled, "but for the last 6 years, the only thing I have built entirely on my own is that center. Every piece of it came from me. The curriculum, the funding, the relationships, the culture." She paused. "If I say yes, and it becomes something backed by Callaway money, will I still recognize what I built? Or will I spend the next 6 years trying to remember what it was supposed to be?" He hadn't expected that. He had expected gratitude. He had been prepared for emotion. He had not been prepared for this. A woman who had thought harder about the implications of accepting help than most of his partners thought about accepting a merger. "What would it need to look like for you to say yes?" he asked. She looked at him as though the question itself was the answer to something. "Can I think about it?" "Take all the time you need." He meant it. He wasn't performing patience. He genuinely, for perhaps the first time in a long time, was willing to wait. Stay with me. Because what she did next is not what you're expecting. And it is, honestly, the best part of this entire story. 5 days passed. The house returned to its routines. She cleaned, she cooked. She left at 6. He worked, he ate, he went to bed. But the silence between them had changed its character. It was no longer the silence of two people who had not yet met. It was the silence of two people who were each, privately, thinking very carefully. On the 5th day, she knocked on his study door at 5:30 p.m. She came in with a folder, a different one than the capstone, newer, thicker, filled with pages that were clearly fresh. She laid it on his desk and stood back. "I want to show you what I've been thinking about," she said. It was a full proposal, not rough notes. An actual proposal, site analysis, budget projections, program design, governance structure, staffing model, community partnership framework. She had identified 5 locations in Raleigh where the need was highest, and a physical space already existed that could be repurposed with minimal renovation. She had costed it out in detail. She had included a timeline. The governance structure was the part that stopped him. She had designed it so that the board of directors was composed primarily of current and former students from Bridgepoint, along with community representatives from each of the 5 proposed neighborhoods. She had written in plain, clear language that no funding partner, including Callaway Hospitality Group or any affiliated entity, would hold a board seat or voting rights over programming decisions. She had called it the Second Word Initiative. She was not asking him to fund his vision. She was asking him to fund hers with no strings attached. Marcus read it twice. When he looked up, she was watching him with that quiet, steady gaze. Calm, but not indifferent. Waiting, but not anxious. The gaze of someone who had already decided that whatever the answer was, she would be fine. She had been fine before. She would be fine again. "You wrote this in 5 days," he said. "I've been thinking about it for 6 years," she said. "I just finally had someone worth writing it for." He set the folder down on his desk. He said yes, not with a handshake, not with a press release, not with any of the formality that attended every other significant transaction of his professional life. He said yes at his desk, at 5:30 in the afternoon, across a folder that smelled like fresh printer paper, to a woman who had cleaned his house for 11 months and built something extraordinary while he wasn't looking. They spent the next 2 hours talking through the details. Real details. Not strategy, not optics, but the actual logistics of how you build something designed to serve the people. The system has already decided don't count. She had answers to every question. She had thought of problems he hadn't thought to raise. She occasionally wrote things down in the folder's margins while he was still speaking. At 7 o'clock, she looked up and said, "Your dinner is going to be completely cold." He realized he had forgotten about dinner entirely. He also realized he couldn't remember the last time that had happened. "We could order something," he said. "I'll cook," she said, and stood up and went to the kitchen, and he followed her without being invited, and they kept talking while she made something simple and good with what was in the refrigerator. And at some point during that evening, sitting at the kitchen table where he used to sit in silence with his phone while she moved silently around him, Marcus Callaway understood that the loneliness he had grown so accustomed to that he had stopped calling it by its name was, quietly, lifting. The Second Word Initiative launched 8 months later. 5 hubs opened in Raleigh on the same Tuesday morning in September. There were no ribbon cuttings, no photographers, no press releases, just doors opening, just folding chairs being set out by volunteers, just adults, quiet, careful, carrying lifetimes of hidden shame about a gap they had been told, directly or indirectly, was their fault, walking through those doors and sitting down. Lily was at all 5 locations that morning. She had driven herself, in the second-hand Civic she'd owned for 3 years, and moved from site to site with a clipboard and a clear sense of exactly what needed to happen and in what order. She shook every hand. She learned every name. She told everyone the same thing. "You belong here. That's not a slogan. It's a fact. The week before the launch, she knocked on Marcus's study door for what she told him would be the last time as his employee. She was holding a white envelope, the formal resignation letter, submitted through the agency's portal. "The initiative needs me full-time," she said, "and so does this house. I can't do both the way either of them deserves." He had known it was coming. He had prepared for it logically. Still, the room felt different when she said it. "Is this what you want?" he asked. "For the first time in a long time," she said, "I know exactly what I want, and I want to protect that clarity." He nodded. He didn't argue. Something she had taught him in these months was that the most genuine form of respect is giving people the space to choose. "I'm going to miss you in this house," he said, simply. She smiled. The real one, the one he had first seen through a window in the dark and now understood was the most honest version of her. "I'll miss making your coffee so badly that you finally learned to make your own." He laughed. It surprised him. On her final evening, he knocked on the door of the small room that had been hers. She opened it and stepped back to let him in. He had been in this room only once before, months ago on a rainy evening, and it had felt then like stepping into a space built not with walls but with quiet determination. It still felt that way. He handed her an envelope, thick, sealed. Inside was a letter he had written across 4 drafts over 3 evenings, about what she had given him without intending to. Not the clean house or the precise meals or the order she had brought to his home. But the thing he had needed more than any of that, the willingness to be broken open by someone else's dignity. There was also a check. Not from the initiative's accounts, from his own personal funds, with a note written in his handwriting. For the next 6 years. She stood in the doorway of that plain, quiet room and read the letter. He watched her hands, which were steady, tremble once, briefly, just once, before she steadied them. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know. That's why I wanted to. Because some things deserve to keep going. Not because someone owes them, but because they're worth it." She folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest. She was quiet for a moment. "My mother would have liked you," she said. "She believed people could change. She used to say it was the most important thing a person could do." He swallowed. "I'm still working on it." "So are most of us," she said. "That's what the center is for." I want to tell you one more thing before we close this story. The Second Word Initiative operates 11 learning hubs today, spread across 3 counties. More than 800 adults have completed foundational literacy programs through those hubs. Several of Lily's original Bridgepoint students have gone on to become volunteer instructors themselves. The 67-year-old retired mechanic who had spent his whole life hiding. He teaches a Wednesday evening class now. He said it was the first time in his life he had ever felt like an expert at something that mattered. Marcus Calloway sits on the initiative's advisory board, not the governance board. He doesn't have a vote over programming exactly as Lily's proposal specified. He funds. He connects. He occasionally shows up to a hub on a Tuesday evening and sits at a folding table with an adult who is learning to read an insurance form, and he does not pretend that being there is a sacrifice. He has told people privately that those Tuesday evenings are the part of his week he looks forward to most. In every Second Word hub above the door, painted in careful letters, is a line that Lily's mother used to say. The same line that is now framed on Marcus Calloway's office wall, right beside the window where the light hits it every morning. "You don't need to be rich to make a difference, you just need to care enough to try." The thing I want to leave with you tonight is not the happy ending. It's the question underneath it. Lily was never invisible. She was always there, complete, purposeful, extraordinary, right in the middle of Marcus Calloway's daily life. She was there every morning when he sat at his breakfast table. She was there in the hallways he walked through without looking. She was there in the quiet and the routine and the parts of his life he had learned to move through on autopilot. And he could not see her. Not because she was hiding, but because he had not yet learned how to look. We all do this. Every one of us. We walk through our days surrounded by people who are carrying whole worlds inside them. People who are building extraordinary things in whatever light they can find, with whatever they have, because they made a promise to someone they loved or because the need was too great to look away from. And we walk past them without stopping, because we are busy, because we are tired, because we have learned to move efficiently through the landscape of our own priorities. The question this story is really asking, the one I want you to sit with tonight, is not what Lily did. She knew what she was doing. She had always known. The question is, what did Marcus have to become before he could finally see her? And what might you be missing right now? Who might you be moving past without stopping? Because you haven't yet decided to look. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think of someone in your own life you might have been walking past without truly seeing, drop their name or their story in the comments below. I want to hear it. These stories matter. And if you know someone who needs to hear something like this today, please share this video with them. That's how these stories find the people they're meant for. Thank you for being here. This is Untold Maid Confessions, where every week we bring you the stories of the people the world walks past, the people who show up quietly, who carry more than anyone knows, who change lives without waiting to be noticed. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, hit the bell, and come back for the next one. I'll see you there.